The Sinclair glowed that night, alive with the delicate chime of fine crystal, the low murmur of hushed conversations, and the drifting scent of truffle oil that lingered in the air like an expensive perfume. I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, trying to ignore the faint tremble in my fingers as I balanced 3 plates of seared scallops along my arm. 2 years of working at the Sinclair, one of the most luxurious restaurants in the Beacon Hill district of Boston, and I still felt like someone who had wandered into a world built for people I had never belonged to. Table 7, Claire. The chef's voice rang out as he pushed a pristine porcelain plate across the stainless steel counter, his eyes already fixed on the next dish without even glancing at me. I nodded even though no one was watching. My shadow blended into the intentional dim corners of the dining room. Servers like us were meant to be invisible, appearing only when needed and vanishing just as quickly. The weight of the day pulled heavily on my shoulders. Double shifts had become routine ever since my mother entered the rehabilitation center after her stroke. The envelopes arriving each week no longer carried utility bills but financial threats printed in unforgiving red ink. A soft thread of jazz curled from the band in the corner as I approached table 8, tucked partially behind a large white orchid that marked the narrow walkway. I kept my eyes lowered while placing each dish before the guests, murmuring, "Please enjoy your meal." The women sitting there wore necklaces worth more than 3 years of my rent, while the men wore watches that could have covered my mother's entire treatment. "Thank you, dear," one of the women said, her diamond tennis bracelet flashing as she lifted her wine glass, though she never truly looked at me. I was just another piece of the backdrop, no different from the crystal chandelier above or the hand-painted silk wallpaper lining the walls. As I turned away, my gaze flickered across the long mirror mounted on the column, and I saw a man walk in. Something about him made the hairs on my arms stand up. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, as if the world had to adjust its pace to match his, not the other way around. His dark suit framed a solid physique, and his amber-tinged hair caught the warm, golden light overhead. He wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, their eyes scanning the room, their hands hovering close to the edges of their jackets, as though something dangerous waited underneath. I forced myself to look away, and continued toward the kitchen. Yet I couldn't help noticing the restaurant manager almost rushed to greet the newcomer, bowing his head slightly. Whoever he was, he didn't need to speak to command respect. "Claire." The chef's voice cut sharply again. "Table 12 needs water. 19 wants dessert." I hurried back into the rhythm of service, though I could not ignore the shift that rippled through the dining room. Conversations slowed. Even the owner, a man I had once watched refuse to serve celebrities, stepped out of his office to personally guide the new arrival to the deepest corner table, the one with a perfect view of the entire room and both entrances. An hour later, with my legs aching and my body running on sheer habit, I caught sight of him again as I cleaned the last table of my section. He was still there with his entourage, now joined by 2 older men with stern expressions. They spoke in low tones, occasionally sweeping their eyes across the room. I tried not to stare, but something about him drew my attention like a magnetic pull, dangerous and irresistible. "Claire, be careful with table 8, Jessica whispered as she passed by. "That's Dominic Moretti." The name made me freeze. In Boston, everyone had heard of the Moretti family. Officially, they owned real estate, logistics, upscale nightclubs. Unofficially, they controlled most of the city's underworld. Dominic had taken over after his father mysteriously disappeared 4 years earlier. No one believed it was voluntary. "I know," I whispered back. I had never seen Dominic's face before, but now I could match the name to the man, and I fully intended to stay away from him. Luck, however, wasn't on my side. As I was gathering dishes to take back to the kitchen, the owner pulled me aside, his expression tight. "Claire, I need you to take table 8 from now on." Anthony had to leave unexpectedly. I hesitated. No buts. They ordered a bottle of Margaux from 1982. You know how to decant properly, right? He pressed the silver corkscrew into my hand and disappeared. My fingers trembled as I prepared the service tray, the decanter, the tall Bordeaux glasses, the folded white cloth. The value of that single bottle was enough to get me fired if anything went wrong. And now I was about to serve it to the man who could quiet an entire crowded room with nothing more than a glance. If you felt the gravity of Dominic Moretti's stare in that luxurious room as clearly as I did, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so we can keep bringing you stories that are haunting, captivating, and full of mystery every day. And tell me, where are you listening from? Leave a comment with your city or country so I'll know just how far Claire's journey has traveled across this wide world. I walked toward table 8, with the wine tray balanced carefully in my hands. Each step, a deliberate effort to keep my legs from shaking and my breath from revealing the tension tightening inside my chest. The rest of the restaurant carried on with practiced normalcy, silverware chiming softly, conversations humming, but at this table every movement felt slower, heavier, as if the air itself thickened around the man seated in the center. Dominic didn't look at me at first. He was speaking to an older man on his left, his voice deep and taut like a string pulled tight. When I stopped by the table, he finally turned. That was the moment I lost any sense of control. His gaze touched me, not with judgment or scrutiny like other patrons, but with a penetrating clarity, as if he could see through every layer of armor I wore each day. His smoke-brown eyes weren't meant for admiring, they were meant for reading. I nodded, placed the tray on the side stand, and gently opened the wine, my hand refusing to tremble. As I tilted the vintage Margaux into the crystal decanter, I felt his eyes remain fixed on me. I forced myself to breathe and move as if nothing were happening. When I poured the tasting sample into the glass, I turned toward him, keeping to the exact steps of proper service. "Please taste," I whispered. Dominic took the glass, never breaking eye contact, and drank a small sip. He nodded once, granting me permission to continue. I poured for the others, setting the last glass down just as a man in the group, gray-haired in a charcoal suit, with a wide gold ring, let out a laugh and leaned slightly toward Dominic, though he looked directly at me. "This one's got skilled hands," he said, "and I bet she's good at more than pouring wine." The table erupted in coarse laughter. Not the pleasant kind, but the testing kind, the evaluating kind. I froze, standing upright, my gaze fixed on the empty space behind him. A part of me wanted to turn and leave, but my feet refused to move. Dominic set his wineglass down with measured calm and turned toward the man who had spoken. His face remained expressionless, yet the air instantly cooled. "That's enough." Only 2 words, not loud, not angry, but heavy enough to silence the entire table. The man leaned back, looking down. Dominic turned toward me again. A faint smile crossed his lips, so small it felt like a flicker. "Thank you, Claire." Hearing my name from him made me stiffen slightly. I wasn't wearing a name tag. I hadn't introduced myself. I nodded, stepping back, but he leaned, in just a fraction, his voice barely audible. "Keep the smile for me, Claire. Don't give it to him." I stilled. It took a moment to realize my expression had reacted out of habit, the polite smile I offered every customer no matter what they said. Dominic had noticed. He didn't want courtesy meant for him to be given to a man who had just insulted me. I didn't understand why he cared. I was just a server, a passing shadow in a life shaped by power and danger. Yet his eyes didn't agree with that story. They said he had noticed me long before I approached his table. I walked away quickly, my heart beating too fast. Jessica glanced at me from the bar where she was polishing glasses. "What happened?" I shook my head. Nothing. But I knew it wasn't true. Because for the first time in months of living like a ghost, I felt as if someone had truly seen me. And that moment, that look, had already begun to change everything. I could still feel Dominic Moretti's gaze lingering on my back, long after I had returned to the bar, as if it clung to the air even when I was no longer standing in front of him. My hand rested on the cool marble countertop while I tried to steady myself, but my heartbeat refused to slow. Jessica glanced at me again, her look carrying both warning and curiosity. I understood it. Dominic wasn't the kind of man you brushed against and then forgot. He left an aftershock, a low, unspoken rumble like distant thunder, heavy but indistinct. When I went back to table 8 to check their glasses and refill the wine, I realized the atmosphere there had shifted. The conversations were quieter now, more restrained, and no one dared make another crude remark. Dominic sat still, one hand resting lightly on the table, the other turning his glass slowly as if performing a private ritual. He didn't speak, but it seemed he didn't need to. His presence alone muted the air. I approached the table, trying to keep my breath steady as I poured wine for the man. On his left, the one with the salt and pepper hair and the uneasy smile. When I reached Dominic's glass, He still didn't look at me, but his hand shifted just slightly, giving me permission. I tilted the bottle, listening to the soft, steady stream of wine filling the glass, the sound somehow louder than everything else in that nearly silent space. Dominic nodded. I acknowledged him with a glance, stepped back, and was about to turn away when I heard a chair scrape softly behind me. I didn't have to look to know whose voice followed. The same man who had spoken out of line earlier said, "Miss, come back here for a moment." I froze. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the tone of someone deliberately testing a boundary. I turned, allowing my eyes to flick briefly toward Dominic. He hadn't moved, but his expression had sharpened, the temperature of the table dropping instantly. The man lifted his glass, tilting it just enough to make the wine inside sway. "There's sediment in my glass," he said. "Check it for me, will you?" I stepped closer and accepted the glass carefully, already knowing the truth. It was perfectly clear. No sediment, no flaw, just a provocation. Before I could respond, Dominic reached out, took the glass from my hand, and set it on his own side of the table. His voice was low but firm. "Claire doesn't need to check anything. If there's a problem, I'll handle it myself." The man's forced laugh cracked the tension but didn't ease it. He shifted back, shrinking slightly in his seat. The air stiffened. Dominic lowered his glass, his eyes fixed on the man as he asked, "Is that unclear to you, Frank?" Frank shook his head quickly and pulled his hands back toward himself. Dominic said nothing further. He simply turned back to me and gave a small nod permission to walk away. I didn't speak. I only dipped my head politely and left. But before I had taken 3 steps, I heard one of the others mutter under his breath, mocking and afraid at the same time, "She's just a waitress." Dominic spoke again, quiet but heavy enough to strike like iron. "She is my guest." Every eye at the table shifted. I stopped in the middle of the aisle, unable to turn around even as his words reached me clearly. "She is my guest." It wasn't just protection. It was a declaration, a line drawn so sharply it seemed to split the world in two. On one side, anyone who dared belittle me, and on the other, him. I moved quickly toward the back counter, where the owner was waiting. He looked at me, not angry, but unsettled. "What are you doing, Claire?" I shook my head. "I'm just pouring wine." He studied me, then sighed. Dominic Moretti never lets someone pour for him twice unless he wants to see them again. I couldn't tell whether it was a warning or a simple fact, but the words stayed with me for the rest of the night. When my shift ended, I changed clothes, hung up my apron, and slipped out the side door as usual, the cold Boston night wrapped around me immediately. I headed toward the bus stop, barely zipped my coat, when a sleek black car pulled up beside the curb, the window lowered. Dominic sat inside, the streetlight casting a pale stripe across his cheek. "Get in, Claire," he said, not as a command but as if it had already been decided. I stood still, my heartbeat rising in slow, distinct thuds. I didn't understand why, but I knew I wouldn't refuse him, because from the moment he said "she is my guest," something in my life had shifted. I stood there beside the glossy black car, its polished surface reflecting the broken gold of the streetlights. My hands resting at my sides, but my palms pressed tight enough for my nails to leave faint crescent marks in my skin. The lowered window framed Dominic's face in warm, dappled light. He wasn't smiling. He simply watched me with a calm certainty, as if he already knew my answer. I stepped closer, hesitated for a heartbeat, then pulled the door handle. Inside, the leather seats were soft, the air carrying a subtle scent of cedar and something distinctly his. Dominic gave a small nod of acknowledgement, a simple gesture that made me feel seen in a way I couldn't explain. He didn't speak for the first few minutes, allowing me to settle. The car glided along the brick-lined streets of Beacon Hill, past dim lights and shadowed trees. I couldn't stop my gaze from drifting toward him. He sat back against the seat, one hand resting on his thigh, his expression composed, though I could sense something simmering beneath the surface, a quiet, controlled intensity. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, smooth, like a dark note sliding across still water. "You were really going to take the bus home?" I nodded. "I do that every night." Dominic looked straight ahead, silence stretching between us before he said, "Not anymore. Not after tonight. Not when you just became the center of a dinner full of people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." I said nothing, partly because I didn't know what to say, and partly because my heart still hadn't found its steady rhythm after the way he'd protected me earlier. After another quiet stretch, Dominic reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He set it gently on my lap. I stared at it without touching it. "Tip money," he said, "and your number." I looked up, startled, ready to protest, but Dominic turned toward me, his gaze sharper now. "Do you really think I'd let a woman walk home at night without a way to reach her?" I bit my lip, my fingers hovering over the envelope. "You don't need to thank me," he added, "and you don't need to call. But I want you to know that if there ever comes a night when the world feels too cold, too loud, or too dangerous, I am someone you can call. No questions asked." I turned my face toward the window, watching the old streets pass by like a silent black and white film. No one had ever said something like that to me. No one had ever made me feel like I mattered, even briefly. The car slowed in front of the worn building where I rented a small one-bedroom apartment. Dominic didn't ask where I lived. He already knew. I stepped out, then leaned down to look back inside. "Thank you for the ride," I said softly. Dominic nodded, saying nothing at first. But just as I began to close the door, he added, "Claire, I am not a good man, but I value what is real. Your smile, your reactions, your silence tonight, they were real. And I have lived too long in a world where the truth is rare." I closed the door gently, then hurried up the stairs as if afraid I might turn back. But even after I entered my apartment, changed into old clothes, and lay on my worn mattress, I still held the envelope in my hands. Inside was enough money to cover 2 weeks of my mother's medical bills, and a small piece of paper with a single string of numbers. No name, no message. But I knew my life had just taken a turn I wasn't prepared to understand. I woke up the next morning with that small piece of paper lying beside my pillow, the neat handwriting quiet and steady, carrying nothing but the silence of the man who had left it. Weak autumn light filtered through my thin curtains, brushing over the familiar cracks in the ceiling, yet something felt different. As if the world had shifted slightly during the night, and I was waking in a parallel version of my life. I washed my face, made a cup of weak coffee, and checked the clock. My mother's therapy was scheduled for 11, and I had the afternoon shift at the restaurant. I checked my wallet and pulled out the envelope still tucked inside my coat. Opening it again, I counted the bills slowly, hardly believing the amount nearly a month's wages if I worked all 7 days each week. I had never held so much cash in my life, especially not from a man I had met only the night before. Beneath the money was the small slip of paper, the numbers etched into my memory. I set it on the table and sat, for a long time. I didn't plan to call him, but I couldn't throw it away either. I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where I kept the things that mattered most. My mother's medical documents, my bent graduation photo, a small wooden bead bracelet she used to wear. That afternoon at the restaurant, whispers spread the moment I walked in. No one said his name outright, but I knew what they were discussing. Dominic Moretti, last night, table 8, that look. Those words. Jessica watched me with a mix of caution and curiosity as I stepped into the service area. "What happened?" she asked, trying to sound casual. I shook my head. "Nothing. I was just doing my job." The owner looked at me differently too, not with his usual irritation over small mistakes, but with an expression I couldn't decipher, as if I had become something he didn't quite know how to manage. During my break, I called the rehabilitation center. The nurse's voice was gentle but tired. My mother was the same, not better, not worse. She didn't talk much, only held my hand when I visited, nearly 2 years now, and every day carried its own quiet ache, a sense of guilt that I couldn't do more. As I slipped my phone into my pocket, another server approached with an envelope. "This was left for you at the front desk." I opened it. No money this time. Just a thin card, blank except for a line written in the same steady hand as the night before. "Tomorrow evening, if you're free." And below it, the address of a waterfront high-rise I recognized instantly, a place where the penthouses were reserved for people whose lives bore no resemblance to mine. No name, no explanation. But I knew it was him, Dominic. I closed my fingers around the card, overwhelmed by feelings I couldn't name: fear, curiosity, unease, and something deeper, quieter, like a tide rising slowly inside a place I had long locked away. I placed the card in my wallet and went back to work. But all through the evening, Shift, I couldn't stop imagining him sitting alone in a room overlooking the harbor, holding a glass of wine, his gaze distant. And I wondered what it was about me that had caught his attention. It wasn't beauty. I had no illusions about that. It wasn't a smile. I had tried not to give him one. But maybe it was the silence. The way I didn't belong in that glittering room. The way my smallness made me stand out more than any sparkle. And now, with the door slightly open, I didn't know whether I should step through. But I also knew that if I didn't, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I dared to take one more step. That evening, I stood before the high-rise tower overlooking the harbor, my hand gripping the strap of my bag as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Inside, warm golden light spilled from the lobby, inviting yet distant. The doorman recognized me the moment I stepped in. He didn't ask my name, didn't hesitate, simply nodded, and sent the elevator gliding toward the top floor. I didn't know if that had been arranged beforehand or if Dominic always orchestrated things in a way that required no words, no confirmations, just silent precision. When the elevator doors opened, they revealed a quiet hallway where recessed lights washed over polished stone floors that reflected each of my steps, as though I were walking through a world slightly detached from the real one. The last door at the end of the corridor shifted open as I approached, and Dominic stood there, leaning casually against the frame with his hands in his pockets. He looked nothing like the imposing man I had first seen at the Sinclair, no tailored suit or aura of untouchable power, just a simple gray turtleneck and soft black trousers. But his eyes were unchanged, sharp enough to cut, deep enough to swallow the truth whole. He stepped aside without a word. I entered, and the apartment opened before me like a piece of abstract art made of glass and steel. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor glittering with scattered lights, and farther out, small boats rested quietly on the dark water. The room smelled faintly of fine leather and oak. Dominic motioned toward the sofa. I sat, folding my hands in my lap, my bag beside me. He didn't sit across from me, choosing instead a corner chair close enough for me to feel his presence without feeling cornered. "You received my invitation," Dominic said, not a question, just acknowledgement. I nodded. "I don't really know why I came. I thought I shouldn't have. Then why are you standing in my doorway tonight?" I had no answer. I could speak aloud. Curiosity, perhaps. A look I couldn't forget. A voice that, for reasons I couldn't understand, made me feel like I wasn't being dismissed the way I was everywhere else. Or maybe something else entirely. Something I wasn't ready to name. Dominic studied me, then leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I didn't invite you here to thank you for doing your job. And I didn't drive you home out of courtesy." I looked at him, trying to keep my gaze steady. "I brought you home because you caught the attention of people I don't trust, and that puts you in danger." My body tightened. "I'm just a waitress. I'm nothing anyone would care about." Dominic shook his head. "True, you have nothing they need. But you have the face of someone who once meant everything to me. You resemble her so much that people could easily mistake you for her. And in my world, sometimes one mistaken assumption is enough to make someone disappear." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Who do I look like?" Dominic turned toward the dark window, his voice dropping lower. "Her name was Emily. She died 3 years ago in a car accident. But I know it wasn't an accident." My pulse slowed but grew heavier, deeper, and now I'm her ghost? "No," Dominic said quickly. "You are Claire, but not everyone will see that, clearly. And if someone believes you have any connection to me, they won't hesitate to act. Then why bring me closer instead of pushing me away?" Dominic turned from the window and looked directly at me. "Because I don't let someone I care about walk into danger alone, especially not when I know exactly what's waiting behind them." "Is this protection or possession?" I asked, my voice soft but steady. Dominic tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's a choice. You can walk out now, and I will have someone follow you to make sure you're safe. Or you can stay tonight and hear the things I've never told anyone else." I didn't speak, didn't move, but I also didn't stand. And I knew the moment I remained seated, I had stepped inside the circle Dominic had drawn, and in his world, once you crossed the threshold, there was rarely an easy way back. The next morning, I woke in an unfamiliar room with high ceilings and tall windows opening to a harbor still wrapped in mist. There were no car horns, no footsteps from neighbors in cramped hallways, None of the weary mechanical clicking from the heater in my tiny apartment. Only near-perfect silence, broken occasionally by the distant tapping of waves against the hulls of docked boats. I didn't know what had made me stay the night. Perhaps it was his promise of protection. Perhaps it was the strange, disorienting sense of safety that seemed to bloom whenever Dominic was near, as if the outside world could not reach me as long as I remained inside his space. When I stepped out, he was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 white porcelain cups. The scent drifted through the room, warm and steady like an unspoken invitation. He placed a cup in front of me when I sat down. I didn't ask how he knew I preferred black coffee without sugar. I didn't ask how he had known my home address, my work schedule, or the name of the rehabilitation center where my mother was staying. Dominic always knew more than he ever admitted. After a few quiet minutes, he set his cup aside and spoke, his tone calm, as if he had rehearsed these words long before I arrived. Today, I want to take you somewhere. Not far, but important. I looked at him, hesitated, then nodded. When we left the building, a black SUV was already waiting at the curb. The driver gave a respectful nod as Dominic opened the door for me first. The city passed by in muted shades through the window, but we weren't heading toward the parts of Boston I knew. We drove into the North End, the oldest part of the city, where brick alleyways and tiny Italian cafes lined narrow streets. The SUV stopped before a 3-story brick home, framed by a black iron fence and a dark wooden door facing a small garden. Dominic opened the door and guided me inside. The house felt hushed, as though every breath taken within its walls still lingered there. The first floor held a living room with a marble fireplace, shelves filled to the brim with books, and an old armchair positioned near the window. He led me up to the second floor, past 2 bedrooms and a sunlit study. I didn't ask questions. I simply followed. Finally, we stopped in the kitchen. Dominic leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on me. This house belonged to my grandmother. She was the only one in my family untouched by the work the men did. After she died, I kept this place as a reminder of what I still have left, even if it's not much. I looked around the kitchen. It wasn't glamorous like the penthouse, but it felt lived in, real. Lace curtains, a small vase of dried flowers, an old photograph hanging crooked on the wall. I turned back to him. "And why bring me here?" Dominic stepped forward, closer but not enough to make me retreat. "Because I need a place for you to stay. Somewhere no one knows about. Somewhere I know is safe." My eyes widened. "You want me to live here?" Dominic nodded. "For a while, yes. Until I'm certain no. One is trying to reach you through any path I can't control." I stepped back instinctively. I can't leave my job. I have my mother. I can't just disappear. Dominic's voice remained even. "You won't disappear. I've arranged it so you can work remotely, and your mother's expenses will be taken care of. All I need is for you to agree to stay out of sight of those asking the wrong questions." I didn't know whether the tightness in my chest was fear or something else, something startlingly close to gratitude. I only knew that this house, with its worn doorknob and the faint traces of a life once lived honestly within its walls, felt more familiar than any place I had been in years. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. Dominic wasn't just protecting me from some unseen threat. He was keeping me close, as if I were the last thing in his world he hadn't already lost. I moved into the house in the North End on a chilly morning when Boston was still, wrapped in a thin veil of mist that draped over the old buildings like a sheer scarf. Dominic wasn't there when I arrived. Only the driver waited, handing me the keys and a small handwritten note containing 4 quiet words. "You are safe now." The first day passed in silence. I cleaned every corner of the house, not because it was dirty, but because I needed something to occupy my hands and keep my mind from wandering anywhere beyond the sound of the broom brushing against the wooden floor. In the afternoon, I found a small wooden box tucked inside the drawer of the living room cabinet. Inside were old photographs faded with age, a few handwritten letters, and a worn leather notebook. On one wrinkled page, I saw the name Emily, written in soft, slanted strokes, signed Emily M. I froze. It felt like trespassing into something that wasn't mine, yet I couldn't pull my hand away. One photograph showed a young woman with wavy reddish-brown hair and gentle eyes that flickered with sharp intelligence. She stood beside Dominic, younger by a few years, but wearing the same cold, controlled expression I had come to recognize. I held the photo up, searching for the resemblance between her and me. The shape of the face, perhaps. The quiet eyes, maybe. But more than anything, I felt her presence in the house, a delicate shadow Dominic had never allowed to fully fade. That evening, Dominic arrived. He walked straight to the kitchen, made 2 cups of tea, and placed one in front of me as if he knew I would need it. I didn't hide the fact that I had found the box. I didn't apologize either. "Was she the woman you loved?" I asked, not out of jealousy, but because I needed to understand where I stood in this story. Dominic remained silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded. "Emily was the only person who ever looked at me without fear. She was the one who argued with me, challenged me, forced me to question the truths I lived by. And she died because of me." I looked at him and, for the first time, saw his eyes break into 1,000 small pieces. "We fought one night. She left, drove away in the rain. I didn't call after her. I thought she would come back. But the next morning, the police called. Her car had gone off the bridge into the river. There was no second chance." Dominic spoke as if he still hadn't forgiven himself. I wanted to say something, but chose silence instead. This kind of grief shouldn't be soothed. It needed to remain exactly as it was, as proof it had existed. The next morning, while I was making coffee, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a woman standing there, dressed in an elegant gray suit, her dark hair tied back, her gaze sharp enough to slice through fabric. "I am Isabella," she said clearly. "I used to be Dominic's closest confidant. And I know you're not Emily." Her first sentence cut across my throat like a thin blade, precise and cold. "I'm not trying to be anyone," I replied, keeping my voice calm. Isabella let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You don't need to. Just standing there, breathing, looking the way you do, that's enough to turn everything upside down. Dominic is repeating an old mistake. And this time, it won't end with an accident." She turned and walked away before I could say anything. I stood frozen at the doorway, the coffee in my hand going cold. I didn't know who Isabella had been to Dominic, but her eyes made one thing clear. My existence unsettled not only him, but also the people watching from the shadows. And the shadow of Emily, though long dead, had never left this house. That night, Dominic didn't come. I didn't ask, and I didn't call. But as darkness settled and the small noises in the old house grew sharper than my thoughts, I felt something shift, a tiny movement, but enough to make my heart slip out of rhythm. I sat alone in the old armchair by the window, the leather notebook resting in my hands. The first page still carried Emily's slanted handwriting. I had read nearly the whole book, each line breathing with her presence, as if she were someone I had known long ago. Emily wasn't just Dominic's former lover. She was a piece of the soul of the world I had stepped into, a silent witness to truths buried under power and secrecy. She wrote about Dominic in the voice of someone who loved him yet feared where that love would lead. She loved his protection, but doubted what it demanded. And then, on the last page, I found words that chilled me. "If I ever disappear, do not believe it was an accident. They will say that. Dominic will stay silent, but that silence is the answer." My heart stopped for a moment. I closed the notebook, set it on the table, and walked through the house, no longer a refuge, but a vessel of secrets. The next morning, I decided to search for the truth myself. I didn't call Dominic. I didn't warn him. I went to Moretti Logistics headquarters, the administrative center of his family's empire. The receptionist looked at me suspiciously, but when I gave my name, she made a call, and within minutes an older man arrived, dressed like a driver, but with eyes sharp as steel. He didn't speak, only gestured for me to follow. We walked through marble hallways and stopped before a large walnut door. Dominic stood by the window when I entered, his back to me. He didn't turn until the door closed behind me. "You read the notebook," he said. I didn't ask how he knew. Dominic always knew everything. I nodded. "So, did you cover up her death?" Dominic finally turned. His face wasn't angry, nor as cold as I expected. Instead, his eyes held a deep exhaustion. "No, Claire. I didn't kill Emily, but I allowed her to die. I didn't understand." Dominic walked toward me, slowly. "Emily discovered something in my family's network, some transaction she believed involved laundering money and weapons. She wanted me to stop. She said if I didn't, she would expose it, and you stayed silent. He nodded. Not because I didn't believe her, but because if that truth came out, not only I, but dozens of others, including innocent people, would be dragged under. You have to understand, Claire, when you stand at the center of a storm, you cannot think only of yourself. I stepped back. So she died because you refused to protect her? Dominic closed his eyes briefly. I didn't assign anyone to watch her that night. I was angry. I thought she was only threatening me. And then the next morning, her car was found in the river. No evidence, no witnesses. Only a body and a pile of unanswered questions. I looked at him, a wave of anger and sorrow crashing together inside me. You've done the same thing to me, Dominic. You pulled me into a world I don't understand, and you think putting me in an old house is enough to protect me. I'm not Emily, and I don't want to become her. Dominic stepped forward, stopping when he saw me retreat. I know. That's why I'm telling you everything. Because you deserve to know. Because I don't want to live with silence again. I turned away and walked toward the door, my heart heavy as stone. I didn't know whether I was angry at him or at myself for wanting to believe in a man like Dominic Moretti. But one thing was certain. From that moment on, I could no longer be who I had been before, because the truth, no matter how painful, had been spoken, and it would change everything. I returned to the house in the North End at dusk, the last sweep of daylight casting a thin wash of amber across the red brick walls. My footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor, each one a reminder of Dominic's words still ringing inside my head. I did not kill Emily, but I let her die. That sentence clung to me the entire way home. In the quiet of the old house, I went straight to the living room and opened Emily's leather-bound notebook again, as if searching for answers in the very place she had tried, in her own way, to preserve them. I reread every line, slower than before, as though patience alone might reveal something I had overlooked. Emily had never been confused. She had known she was being watched. She had understood that something larger, darker, operated beneath the surface of what looked like legitimate business dealings. Dominic hadn't denied that, nor had he tried to justify it. He told me everything in that deep, steady voice of his, as though he had spent a lifetime burying entire storms inside himself, and now was willing to reveal only enough to let me see, but not enough for me to fully understand. But even that small portion showed me more than I had ever imagined. I learned about his family's ties to underground financial networks, the dirty investments laundered through shell companies, and most importantly, Dominic's silence, the silence that had allowed the whole system to survive. Emily had been the first person to threaten that balance, and she disappeared soon after. I wasn't sure it was coincidence. Dominic wasn't sure either, but he had done nothing to stop it. And that was what frightened me, not because he was cruel, but because he was accustomed to doing nothing when action was required. When I placed the notebook back in the drawer, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering. Isabella's voice came through, sharp and cold. You should not be there, Claire. I thought you were smarter than that. I said nothing, but my fingers tightened around the phone. Dominic told me everything. I don't need your permission to be anywhere. Isabella gave a low, cutting laugh. Dominic only told you what he wanted you to hear. What he did not tell you, do you dare ask? I stayed silent. She went on. You know why Emily died. But do you know she was pregnant before she did? My body froze. My heartbeat staggered. Isabella paused, then spoke more slowly. That is right. Dominic never told anyone. Not me, not anyone. I was the one who took her to the hospital for her last appointment. Emily intended to keep the baby, even though Dominic did not want her to. She thought it would change him. She was wrong. I hung up without saying another word. My mind spun, unable to separate truth from manipulation. Dominic had never mentioned that, not once. He spoke of love, spoke of regret, but never said he had been about to become a father. If what Isabella said was true, then his silence was more terrifying than Emily's death. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, knees pulled close, and for the first time since meeting him, a coldness crept through me, bone deep. Not because Dominic had hidden something, but because I had trusted a man who could make the truth disappear simply by refusing to speak it. I did not know how much of him I could trust. But I knew that from that moment on, something between us had shifted forever. Doubt had entered the space that once felt familiar, and from now on, I would never look at him with the same eyes. I did not sleep the entire night. I lay on the old bed in the North End house, staring into the dark, unsure if the sound I heard was the ticking clock or my own pulse. Isabella's words repeated inside my head like a curse I could not break. Emily had been pregnant. Did Dominic know? If he did, why did he never say a word? If he didn't, why had I believed he was the kind of man who knew everything? Was it possible he truly hadn't known? And if so, how deeply would it break him to learn it now from me, a stranger who had entered his life too late to save anything? Dawn filtered through the window in a pale wash, and still I had not closed my eyes. I rose, put on my coat, and walked out of the house. The early wind was sharp and cold, weaving through the brick streets, carrying the scent of salt water and exhaust. I did not know where I was going until I found myself in front of a small corner cafe, its warm yellow light glowing against fogged windows. I stepped inside, ordered an espresso, and sat in the corner as though hiding from the world. I needed to think. I needed to know what I would lose if I stayed and what I would sacrifice if I left. After more than an hour, my phone rang. Dominic. I let it ring. A minute later, a text arrived. Come home, now. I stared at the screen, unmoving. Then another message. You are in danger. I stood up immediately. When I returned to the house, Dominic was already at the gate. Black coat, hands in his pockets, eyes cold as winter ice. As soon as I stepped through the door, he spoke, without preamble. Someone saw you leave the house at 6 this morning. They know you're outside my control. I let out a short, bitter laugh, the first time I had ever dared look directly into his eyes without fear. I am not your prisoner, Dominic. I have the right to breathe, to step outside if I want. Dominic moved closer, not angry, but carrying a silent force that tightened the air. This isn't about rights anymore, Claire. This is about survival. I stared at him, feeling something inside me fracture further. You know I spoke with Isabella, don't you? Dominic didn't blink. I know. She still hasn't given up her games. My voice trembled with anger. She said Emily was pregnant. Before she died. Dominic froze, just for an instant. His eyes flickered, like the surface of a lake struck by sudden wind. Who told you that? He asked, his voice far lower. I already said. Isabella. And you never mentioned it. Dominic turned away, his hands tightening into fists. I did not know. Emily never told me. If she knew, she kept it from me. Or, she knew I would never let her go if I found out. I swallowed hard, my hands turning cold. He stayed silent for a long moment, then faced me again, stripped of every layer of armor. If I had known, I swear, I would have protected her with everything I had. I nodded, but the storm inside me did not quiet. Dominic exhaled sharply, then pointed toward the dining table where he had placed a stack of papers. We cannot keep hiding and pretending everything will pass on its own. From now on, there are rules you have to learn if you want to stay alive. I walked over and scanned the notes. Never leave the house without warning. Always carry the encrypted phone. Do not open the door unless you know who is outside. Do not reveal your location through social media, messages, or anything connected to the internet. In an emergency, call this number. He tapped a handwritten line, not his personal one. The person who answers will know what to do. And finally, if you ever feel followed, go to the brightest, most crowded place, and stay there until someone comes for you. When I finished, my hands were trembling. Dominic watched me, his gaze softening. I know this is too much for you, but once you step into my world, safety is no longer something that happens by chance. You have to fight for it, every day. I nodded, my thoughts tangled but clear on one truth. From here on out, nothing was about love or not love. It was about living or not living. And I knew then that I would have to learn not only how to trust Dominic, but how to survive in his world, where danger and devotion walked side by side, where truth was a weapon, and silence was the only armor I had. 3 days after Dominic laid out the survival rules, I woke to a message stranger than anything that had come before it. He knocked on my door while I was brushing my hair, holding a thin box wrapped in gray silk paper, and set it on the bed without offering an explanation. Tonight you're coming with me. Not to hide, but to be seen. I looked at him, trying to read the meaning behind that calm gaze. There's a fundraising event. A lot of important people will be there, including those who believe you don't exist. I understood instantly. This wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration. I was no longer the girl tucked away in the shadows. I would stand beside Dominic Moretti as something like a companion, a role he had chosen for me. And then he said the phrase that sent something trembling through me. "We'll temporarily play the part of a couple, a fabricated relationship, to protect you, and to send a message that you aren't an easy target." I didn't answer right away. I picked up the box and opened it, finding a long black dress, elegant and fluid as water. Beneath it lay a pair of small stone earrings and a thin card with the address of the event. I thought of everything that had happened from that first night in the restaurant to this moment in a house that once belonged to his grandmother. Maybe pretending was the only way to stay balanced in a reality shifting by the hour. That evening, Dominic came to pick me up in the familiar black car. He wore a black suit, a silk tie, and the kind of composed expression that made it seem as if he did this every week. Perhaps he did. I stepped out wearing the dress he chose, feeling as if I'd slipped into another skin, a stronger version of myself that I barely recognized. When the car pulled up in front of the hotel hosting the event, camera flashes burst like fireworks. Dominic took my hand, gentle but sure, as though reminding me of the part I had to play. "Are you all right?" he asked softly as we walked onto the carpet. I nodded with a faint smile. "I'm all right." Inside, the room brimmed with light and laughter, glasses of wine catching the glow, eyes slicing through the crowd like invisible blades. Dominic introduced me as Claire, his new companion, his voice steady and unhesitant. I smiled, shook hands with strangers, and held myself the way someone born into this world might. But I felt the women's stares, half surprise, half scrutiny, and the men's stares, sharper, colder, not friendly at all. In that brief moment, I understood that my presence wasn't a game. It was a statement of power, that Dominic had chosen me and that alone made me a target. We passed a group of men mid-conversation, all of whom fell silent when Dominic approached. One older man with graying hair smiled thinly at me. "A new girl, then. Let's hope you can keep this one." Dominic didn't answer, only placed his hand at the small of my back, a subtle act of possession. When we left the event, I asked him in the car, who were they? Dominic glanced at me, his voice lower than usual. "Men who, if they knew you were real, would never allow you out of their sight again. Tonight, you were an illusion. And you performed well." I leaned my head against the window, watching my reflection flicker between passing streetlights. The role wasn't just a mask anymore. It was seeping into me, blurring what was real and what wasn't. But if pretending was the only way to survive, I would do it. And if one day Dominic no longer needed the pretense, I could only hope that by then I would still have enough of myself left to choose. The morning after the event, I woke with a faint dizziness. Not from wine I had only taken a single sip, but from the strange exhaustion of stretching every sense to play someone I wasn't. Dominic had left early, a quick note saying he'd see me that evening and a warm cup of coffee sitting neatly on the table. I didn't leave the house that day, wandering from room to room, replaying fragments of conversations, and trying to separate the Dominic I'd come to know from the man the outside world watched so closely. But the afternoon passed too quietly, the kind of quiet that feeds suspicion. When the doorbell rang a little past 4, a cold shiver slid down my spine without explanation. I opened the door to see Jessica, my coworker from the restaurant, standing there wide-eyed, hair disheveled, hands trembling. "Claire, I didn't know who else to come to. I think I'm being followed." I pulled her inside and shut the door. She sat on the couch, shaking, clutching her phone. "There's a black car. It's been outside my place all morning. No license plates. And when I went to work, a strange man was standing in front of the restaurant, staring at me. He didn't say anything, just stared, like he was threatening me without words." My entire body went cold. Jessica had nothing to do with Dominic. She wasn't part of anything, but she was the only person who could be seen as close to me. I grabbed my phone and called Dominic. He answered after a few rings. "Dominic, something's happened. Jessica's here. She's being followed." "A strange car? A strange man." Dominic was silent for a moment. "Take her to the basement. There's a safe room. The code is your birthday written backward." I did as he said, guiding Jessica downstairs. The small room felt like an underground bunker, with a locking system and filtered air. Dominic arrived in less than 20 minutes. He walked into the house without a word, looked at me once, then went straight down to check on her. When he was certain she was safe, he returned to the living room. "They weren't targeting you," Dominic said quietly. "They were sending a warning, that they know who you are, that they know where you are, and if you don't obey, an innocent person will pay the price." My hands tightened around the armrest. So this was their strategy. No blood, just fear, aimed precisely. Dominic nodded. "You're becoming a weakness in their eyes, and they want me to understand that anyone connected to you will never be safe." For the first time, I saw anger in Dominic's eyes, not explosive, but something old and compressed, finally cracking through the cold mask he always wore. "So what do we do?" I asked. Dominic studied me slowly. "We can't run forever. But before we strike back, I need to take you and everyone you care about out of their reach. I'll arrange for your mother to be moved to another facility. Better care, stronger security. And Jessica, she'll have to leave Boston for a while." As I listened, I felt the thin layers of peace I had held onto peeling away, revealing the raw truth of the world I had stepped into. Dominic had never exaggerated when he said this place ran on threats and silence. One small sign, and they knew exactly where to strike to cause pain without touching the true target. That night, I didn't sleep. Neither did Dominic. We sat in the living room, listening to the wind scrape against the windows and the steady ticking of the clock. I wondered whether men like Dominic ever felt fear. He stared into the cold fireplace, unmoving. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough like the night air. "When they attack the place closest to your heart, that's when you have to choose. You either step back or you step forward. And Claire, it's time for you to know which one you're choosing." I did not answer Dominic that night, only sat in silence watching the small fire he had just coaxed back to life in the hearth, listening to the soft crackle of wood like time splintering inside my head. I had always believed that trust was something born at the beginning, an instinctive certainty that someone would not harm you the moment you looked at them. But Dominic was a far more complicated equation. Trust with him was not a starting point but a journey, an unpaved road where every step was a test and every fall could be the final one. The next day, Dominic left me a detailed list of the new security changes around the house, the transfer schedule for my mother, and the location where she would be cared for by a private medical team. I read every line carefully, not out of suspicion but because I understood he had already thought 10 steps ahead of me. He did not ask for gratitude, nor did he expect praise. He simply acted quietly, as if it were a responsibility and not something to be acknowledged. That was how Dominic built trust, not through promises, but through actions repeated until doubt had no ground left. In the days that followed, he spent more time at home. Not to monitor me, but to make sure I felt his presence. He cooked dinner with me, stood beside me washing dishes while I wiped the counters, his gaze steady in the quiet moments that did not need to be filled. I began to understand that his care was never loud. It showed in how he knew I liked my morning coffee weak but needed it stronger in the afternoon, how he quietly reorganized a cabinet when he noticed I couldn't find the sugar. One night, as I sat by the window, writing in my journal, Dominic walked over and handed me a cup of hot cocoa. "Writing something?" he asked. I smiled. "Nothing important, just thoughts." He sat in the chair across from me, the warm glow of the lamp softening the sharpness in his features. After a long pause, he spoke slowly. "I've never explained myself to anyone like this, but with you, I feel the need." I set my pen down. "Because I don't fully trust you yet?" Dominic shook his head. "No, because I want you to see the real me, not the version others created. And if you ever choose to trust me, I want that choice to have a foundation, not force." I nodded, feeling something loosen in my chest. Dominic didn't demand trust. He created space for it, leaving the door open just wide enough for me to walk through if I wished. And I did just a small step by offering him a piece of the cake I had just baked. He smiled, a rare smile without a shadow in his eyes. Too sweet, but edible. We laughed, a quiet relief in days stretched tight like a drawn string. I found myself telling him about my childhood, about my father, the plumber with rough, cracked hands, who still polished my shoes every night before school. Dominic said nothing, only listened. And I realized that he needed these stories to remind himself he was still human, not the machine of power the world believed him to be. One afternoon, as we walked through the North End Market, my hand brushed his. He closed, his fingers around mine, lightly, wordlessly. But that small gesture felt like a declaration. We still weren't anything defined, yet we were moving slowly, carefully, toward something that felt like a beginning. Trust was no longer something to give blindly. It was something being built between us, minute by minute, through silence, through patience. Through the fragments of ourselves we were slowly learning to piece back together. And though I was unsure of the future, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be, beside the right person, at least in this moment. That morning the rain fell lightly, each drop tapping against the kitchen window, as if reminding us that time moved on regardless of our turmoil. I woke earlier than usual, not from fear, but because I had dreamt of my father sitting in his old wooden chair, cleaning my muddy shoes just as he used to when I was a child, silent and slow, as if it were the most important task in the world. When I came downstairs, Dominic was already there, pouring coffee. His movements so familiar that it felt as though he had lived here much longer than a handful of weeks. He looked up with a faint smile. "It's raining today." I nodded, took the cup he offered, and sat across from him. He added sugar to his own 1.5 spoonfuls, always exact. After a moment, he spoke first. "You know, I used to hate the rain." I looked at him, surprised. He rarely mentioned his mother. "She didn't cry because she was sad," he continued. "It reminded her of something. Someone, a promise broken. I never asked. I just sat beside her until she was done. Some memories aren't meant to be dug up. Being there is enough." I understood. Some wounds needed to be left untouched, not out of fear, but out of respect. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. "Are you afraid of me, Claire?" he asked quietly, and I knew he wanted the truth. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "No, but I'm afraid of what comes, with you. Not because it's terrible, but because I don't know if I'm strong enough to bear a piece of it." Dominic nodded, as if he had anticipated that. "I once asked Emily the same question," he said. "She never answered, just looked at me. And to this day, I still don't know what that look meant." I stayed silent. Dominic drew a long breath. "The night she died, I had a dream of her standing on a fog-covered bridge, holding her hand out. I ran to her, but the closer I came, the longer the bridge stretched. When I couldn't breathe anymore, she disappeared. I never dreamt again. But I never slept peacefully either. For the first time, I saw the man before me not as the Dominic Moretti, who made deadly phone calls and stared down powerful men, but as someone carrying countless unnamed regrets and surviving them only by keeping people at arm's length. Yet he had let me close, and I had stayed. "I have a recurring dream too," I whispered. "I'm in the kitchen, my father cleaning my shoes like always. But when I bend down to thank him, he has no face, just a blur, and I cry without knowing why." Dominic didn't respond with words. He simply placed his hand over mine, warm, steady. We sat like that, with the faint smell of coffee and the soft tapping of rain outside, two people with separate wounds learning how to touch each other without fear, only truth. And truth, messy, painful, contradictory, was the reason we were both still here, under a roof not tied to our pasts, but slowly being built by trust. That afternoon, after the rain eased and the Boston sky turned a pale gray like a thin layer of ash, Dominic told me to dress warmly and get in the car. He didn't say where we were going, only looked at me with a quiet depth that felt like the stillness before a storm. I didn't ask. I was learning to walk beside him without needing every answer. The car wound through familiar streets, then veered into a narrow road leading toward Ononary, the southern outskirts of the city. Each turn felt like another page of a story Dominic had kept locked for years. When the car stopped in front of a small, old wooden house, white-gray, moss clinging to the roof, Dominic finally spoke, his voice barely above a breath. "This is where I grew up." The yard was bare, lawn thick and unkempt, a lone maple tree leaning over the porch. Nothing grand. Ordinary, almost painfully so. The kind of place you'd never expect to shape a man like Dominic Moretti. But then I understood darkness doesn't always begin in dark places. Sometimes it grows quietly in the most peaceful corners of the world. Dominic stepped inside first. The scent of old wood and dust rose like the breath of time. Everything was still there, undisturbed. A black and white photo hung on the wall, a family of 3. a stern-faced man, a woman with deep, gentle eyes startlingly like Dominic's, and a young boy, around 8, standing between them, not smiling. Dominic moved, slowly toward the kitchen, his fingers brushing the cold countertop. My mother died here. A stroke. One winter morning. I wasn't home. By the time the neighbors found her, she was gone. I never got to say goodbye. He paused, his gaze drifting far away. My father died a few years earlier. A bullet to the back of his head. The news called it an occupational accident, but everyone knew what he was involved in. I sat on a wooden chair, my throat dry. Dominic poured himself a glass of water and sat across from me. I was 18, alone with debts, lawyers, police, and strangers offering condolences with dry eyes. Then a man came. Salvatore. He said my father had helped him, and now it was his turn to help me. Dominic stopped, as if listening to the echo of that memory in the kitchen walls. He pulled me into his world. Meetings with no names, conversations spoken through glances, not words. I had no other path. School revoked my scholarship the moment they learned my biaga, family's ties. They said I was a risk, and they were right. I've never been harmless. I didn't realize I had clenched my fists on the table until Dominic gently placed his hand over mine. He held my eyes as he continued. I've done many wrong things. Too many. Some names I remember. Some I try to forget. But I have never felt more alive than when I'm with you. Claire, you are unlike anything I've ever known. You're not Emily. You're not anyone from my world. And I know that scares you. I swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, I'm scared. But not of your past. I'm scared because I'm putting my present in the hands of a man I've never seen without his defenses, without the mask. Dominic squeezed my hand gently, exhaling slowly. Then let this be the first time. Nothing hidden, nothing to lose. Just me, and you, in the house where it all began, so you'll understand I'm not the darkness. I'm the man who walked out of it. I looked at him for a long time, then nodded softly. I trust you. Not because of what you told me, but because of how you told it. And if your past is what I must accept to keep this present, then I will learn to take it in with my eyes open, not closed. To see you clearly, to understand myself better, and to know that whatever is growing between us, born from fear and doubt, is now being built on truth. We left the old house when the sky had faded into a shade of silvery ash, the cool air settling over everything, as if Boston itself was trying to soothe the memories that had just been stirred. Dominic did not say where he intended to take me next, but when the car turned onto a narrow forest road on the western outskirts of the city, I began to understand. The bare trees swayed gently in the wind, creating a strange feeling of stillness, weighted with something unspoken. When the car stopped before an old cemetery, where weathered stones lay scattered like quiet punctuation marks at the end of unfinished stories, Dominic turned off the engine and stared ahead for a long time. If you want to go back to the car, I'll understand. But if you walk with me, let me walk beside you, not behind you, not at a distance. I took his hand and nodded. We walked deeper into the graveyard where wildflowers pushed up between the stones. On a small hill near an old oak tree stood a simple marble headstone. No picture, only a delicate engraving of the name Emily Rosario, her birth and death years, and a short line in Italian that translated loosely to, "She smiled as if she already knew something meant to be remembered forever." Dominic stood before the grave with his hands in his pockets, his head slightly bowed. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The silence was not emptiness, but space for what words could never touch. After a while, he spoke. The last time he saw Emily was in her apartment. She told him she would leave Boston for a few weeks to rest, to find balance again. He didn't ask where, didn't try to stop her. He had stood by the door watching her pack a few books and a thin coat. They exchanged a soft kiss, and she stepped into the hallway. That was the last time. No one ever saw her leave the city. No flight, no hotel record, nothing. 4 days later, the police called. Her body had been found by the riverbank. Dominic did not shed tears. His voice was even, almost detached from himself, but I knew inside he was grinding himself into dust. "You know, Claire," he murmured, "I haven't brought anyone here since that day. Not Isabella, not Salvatore, no one, only me, once a year, until today." I stepped forward, and placed the lavender bouquet I had brought beside the headstone. "I didn't know you, Emily," I whispered. "But I think I understand you. I've read what you wrote. I see your imprint in the way Dominic is quiet, in the way he weighs every decision. You left more than memories. You left a standard, and I'm not here to replace you. I'm here to continue something you didn't get the chance to finish." Dominic looked at me then, his gaze gentling like a storm passing, leaving only still water in its wake. "Thank you," he said. "Not for coming, for not turning away." We left the cemetery as the sun dipped low, its final light stretching our shadows long across the gravel path. On the drive back, neither of us spoke. But between us lay a shared, wordless understanding, shaped by separate losses and an unspoken promise that the past, though unchangeable, might no longer be a burden if carried together. 3 days after our visit to Emily's grave, Dominic received a call near midnight. I heard his voice in the hallway, low, steady, like an undercurrent pulling from deep water. Not angry, not shaken, but stripped of the tight restraint he usually wore in his eyes. When he came back into the room, the lamplight revealed something I had never seen on him in weeks. The absence of tension, an emptiness almost eerie. He sat on the edge of the bed and took my hand, as if he had been waiting all day just to anchor himself to something real. "Salvatore has been arrested," he said softly, each word sinking into the space between us. A federal operation had traced funds from a money-laundering real estate project in Miami, and then everything unraveled. Names once hidden behind curtains were being dragged into the light one by one, including those who had protected Dominic and pushed him forward like a well-placed chess piece. He didn't say it aloud, but I knew. This was not a surprise. He had prepared for it. In recent months, every step, every call, every meeting had been part of a quiet plan to untangle the knot that had bound his life for so long. And now the final chain had snapped. But freedom did not arrive like fireworks. It came wrapped in a near unbelievable silence, where Dominic sat unmoving, not relieved, not victorious, just strangely hollow. I cupped his face, urging him to look at me. "It's over," I whispered. "No one can hurt you anymore, or the people around you." Dominic nodded slowly. "I don't know who I am without a fight. I'm used to expecting betrayal, used to questioning everything. Freedom feels more foreign to me than prison." I let out a small, sad smile. "Then learn again. With me. No rush. You don't have to be strong all the time. We can be unsure, lost, starting over, even wrong. But this time, we do it together." The next day, the arrest was everywhere on the news. Dominic made no statement, issued no comment. But those who understood the world he came from understood this much. He had stepped out of the game. No one dared touch him now. Not because he was protected, but because they knew that when a man like Dominic Moretti walked away from everything, it meant he was giving up the very power they craved. And a man with nothing left to lose was more dangerous than any weapon. I watched the final news clip showing Salvatore being escorted off a plane, hands cuffed, head bowed. I turned off the television and stepped onto the porch, where Dominic sat with a glass of whiskey, staring out toward the fog-softened horizon. I sat beside him without a word. We listened to the wind slip across the roof tiles, to the soft flutter of birds along the tree line. The feeling of no longer being hunted, no longer needing to hide, no longer sensing eyes following every step. It was strange, yet quietly peaceful. Dominic turned to me, and for the first time there was no shield in his gaze. "We survived," he said, as if survival itself were a miracle. "And you didn't leave." "I never thought of leaving," I answered softly. Dominic nodded, set his glass down, and wrapped his fingers around my hand as if afraid it might vanish if he didn't hold on. I rested my head on his shoulder, closed my eyes, and felt for the first time that the future was no longer a gray veil hiding all the ways life could break us. And as the night settled over us with no warning sirens, no strange cars waiting in the dark, only the sound of two people learning how to exist in a world no longer haunted by shadows, I knew we had crossed the final threshold, not through gunfire, but through the choice to hold on to each other when everything else had fallen away. The morning after Salvatore was arrested, the house fell into a strange kind of quiet, not the tense silence we had grown accustomed to, but a gentle stillness, like the breath the earth takes after a storm has passed, and all that remains is the scent of damp soil and a clear sky above. Dominic was still asleep, his breathing even and deep beside me, for the first time not curling in on himself or jolting awake in the middle of the night. I lay there with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint rattle of the window as the early wind brushed past it. I knew everything had changed. But what unsettled me was not that Dominic was finally safe. It was the question of what safety meant for me. I was no longer being watched, no longer needing to glance over my shoulder or live in a state of constant alert. And yet I found myself wondering where my life would go now that fear was no longer the force steering its course. I went downstairs, made coffee for myself, and stood by the window looking out at the backyard, where sunlight was beginning to touch each small stone on the path. My life before had been simple. I worked at the restaurant, sent money to my mother, and waited for the day she would recover enough to return home. But now my mother was being cared for better than she had ever been, all expenses handled by Dominic, and I was living in the center of a life that once belonged to a man who existed only in rumors and shadows. Dominic came down the stairs while I was rinsing a cup, his hair slightly tousled, wearing an old gray shirt that made him look like any ordinary man, not the controlled and distant figure the world knew. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, warm and unforced. He asked quietly, "What are you thinking about?" I did not answer immediately. I leaned my head against his shoulder before speaking softly. "I think it's time I choose for myself." Dominic let go and turned me to face him, his eyes holding no surprise, only patience. "What do you want, Claire?" I looked into his eyes, feeling for the first time the certainty of my own voice. "I don't want to live in anyone's shadow, not even yours. I don't want my life to be a continuation of someone else's story. I know I love you, but love cannot be a place where I hide forever. I need a life that belongs to me." Dominic nodded slowly, calmly. He did not ask where I would go or how long I would be gone. He only said, "If you need help, all you have to do is ask. And if you need room to begin again, I will step back so you have that space." I could not stop the tears that came, not from sadness, but from the weight of being given freedom so completely, without condition or negotiation. A week later, I moved into a small apartment near the river, not far from Dominic's home but far enough to give me my own life. I began working with a nonprofit organization that supported women who had endured abuse or lost their sense of direction after trauma, women who had once been like me, like Emily. And I wrote, for the first time in months, not in a journal, but for others to read, sharing my story without softening its edges or hiding what had hurt. Dominic visited every weekend. We cooked, took walks, or simply sat on the balcony listening to the city breath quietly in the distance. No roles, no guarded spaces. Love was no longer an anchor clung to in the storm, but a choice made each day when the world was calm. And I knew the greatest choice of my life was not loving him, but loving myself enough to step out of the shadow of my past, stand in the light, and still open my heart to a man like Dominic. Not out of fear of losing him, but from knowing I could walk away and still choose to stay. When spring began to touch the trees in Boston with a tender wash of green and soft breezes, I realized it had been more than 2 months since I moved out of Dominic's home. Time passed slower but deeper, each day a piece of healing and affirmation. I was no longer the lost woman in a black dress standing in the middle of a room full of strangers. I was Claire, with work I loved, a small, beautiful apartment, and a growing belief that my life was no longer defined by fear but by my own choices. Dominic never pushed me to return, never tried to turn my peace into something that belonged to him. Yet his presence remained steady as a lighthouse, not overwhelming but constant, a soft glow always within sight. We did not see each other every day, but each meeting was enough to remind me that love did not need possession to exist. One early April evening, Dominic invited me back to North End for dinner. I said yes, not out of courtesy but because something in his voice told me he needed me in a different way. When I arrived, the house had not changed. The old wooden doors, the faint smell of baked bread drifting from the kitchen, the warm yellow glow over the living room. But something in the air felt different. Dominic was in the kitchen preparing lasagna, the one dish he knew I loved. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly, not the powerful man from his former life, but someone learning to cook for the woman he loved. After dinner, we sat on the porch where he had placed 2 new wicker chairs and a small wooden table. He looked at me with eyes steady and quiet. "Claire," he said, "I've wanted to tell you this for a long time. but I needed to know you would hear it as a free woman, not someone shaped by circumstance. I nodded, my heart tightening with a soft, unfamiliar anticipation. Dominic drew a deep breath. You're not someone I need to protect anymore. You're not an excuse to hide the weaker parts of myself. You are the person I want to walk beside, not as someone I must hold on to, but as someone invited to stay. If you choose it, this house won't be a sanctuary. It will be a home, for both of us. I looked at him for a long moment, unable to speak because my heart was beating too loudly. Then I stood, walked through each room, touched the old furniture, the crooked picture frames, the lingering shadows of the past. And when I returned to the porch, I said only 4 words, enough to change everything. I choose to stay. Dominic did not smile, but his eyes grew wet. He rose and embraced me, holding me as if after many years he could finally breathe without fear of loss. In the days that followed, we began shaping a new life. Not loud, not grand. We went to Sunday markets together, tended the garden, read books side by side in quiet. Isabella visited, looked at Dominic and me, and smiled with eyes no longer carrying pain. She was no longer Emily's shadow, and I was no longer a replacement. We were different pieces in a family forming not through blood, but through chosen connection. One afternoon, while I was sorting books on the living room floor, Dominic walked in with a small box. Inside was a new key. You can change the locks if you want, he said. But this is your home, not because I give it to you, but because you have made it a place where life can be lived. I held the key in my hand and understood for the first time what it meant not to feel imprisoned. Not a captive, but part of a family chosen, built not from the past, but from love in the present. And I knew that no matter how uncertain the future might be, I would always have a place to return to, not to hide, but to live fully as myself. In the soft glow of early summer sunlight filtering through the curtains that morning, the small kitchen where I stood making coffee turned golden, and Dominic sat at the table flipping through the pages of his newspaper as he always did, his eyes calm, no longer shadowed by the darkness that once weighed on him. I looked at him and suddenly realized that the smile on his lips was no longer the guarded smile of our early days, nor the fragile mask of a man fighting an inner storm. It was a real smile, whole and peaceful, one that belonged entirely to the present moment. I smiled back, and for the first time in so many months, I felt myself truly smiling too, not out of politeness, not to soothe someone else, but because I was genuinely happy. Happiness had not come from a perfect ending, but from the journey we had survived together, through trust, through scars, through all the moments when we almost let go. Dominic and I were far from perfect, but we chose each other every single day. And in that choice, we learned how to heal, not only for each other, but for ourselves. The greatest lesson in this story is not found in the dramatic moments, not in the revelations or the threats that dissolved, but in patience. Patience to wait for someone to be ready to love, patient enough to face their past, and gentle enough to build a future together. In a world so loud, where love is often mistaken for possession, choosing to love someone as they are, embracing both their shadows and their light, becomes the bravest thing a person can do. Dominic was no longer a man hidden behind power and darkness. He was simply a man learning to grow plants, to cook meals, and to sit quietly for hours listening to me talk about my day. And I was no longer the girl pulled unwillingly into his world. I was the woman standing beside him, not behind him. In this relationship, neither of us was anyone's prisoner. We were a family. We were each other's freedom. And to me, that was the truest beginning. If you have been following this story, thank you for walking with Claire and Dominic all the way to these final lines. How do you feel after witnessing their journey? Did something in their story remind you of yourself, or of someone who once passed through your life? We would love to hear your thoughts, your feelings, the experiences that rise from your heart. Please don't hesitate to share them in the comments below. Every story deserves to be heard, and sometimes, a quiet line from you may be the light someone else needs. If this story touched you, please support us by liking the video, subscribing to our channel so you won't miss the heartfelt stories we share every day, and sharing the video with those you care about. We are committed to bringing you stories that not only entertain, but also move and nourish the soul, especially for mature audiences seeking empathy, healing, and hope in the many layers of life. Thank you for spending your time with us. We wish you good health, a peaceful life, and gentle happiness in every day ahead. We look forward to seeing you again in the next video, with a new story, a new journey, and perhaps a new genuine smile of your own, just like the one Claire and Dominic found. Goodbye, and see you in the videos to come.